slide up here. Laura, I love this image. This is the best image. And Leah, are you, were you in Minneapolis too?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And are you, I know you're here in DC now. Are you also covering protests here, or what are you covering?
Yeah, I've covered, I was in Minneapolis for a week, and then I came back here to the protests here.
Okay.
And I covered like the big one that was, I think it was like not this last Saturday, but the Saturday before that.
Before that, yep. Yeah, okay. All right, so maybe at the end we'll kind of bring in, converge, what's happening along with that's happening here. So
I threw together, that's why I was a couple of minutes behind, because I threw together a little slideshow just in case we were going to go over some of that stuff, because it's really interesting to compare them. There's actually a photo that I took of an old man staring at the police while they're arresting a young person right in front of him. Okay. And it made me think of this photo.
Okay. Great.
They arrested him too eventually, but
okay. All right, so everybody, thanks for joining. We're going to get started in about probably 30-45 seconds. We'll give people a chance to log in, give about another minute, and then we'll get started. Great. Yeah, it's been kind of crazy. I live in Arlington, so I work in DC. So I'm
oh yeah,
been paying attention to the local scene here. Yeah.
Yeah, my partner covers protests for the Post, so it's been an interesting time in our house.
Yeah, I bet. All right, got people logging in. We're gonna wait just a couple more, like 30 more. So people are usually a little bit late getting in. So, hey, good morning, everybody. If you're already logged in, give us a little shout out in the chat and let us know where you're logging in from. That would be great. I see David said good morning. Hey, Marcy. Marcy's in Washington, D.C. Great to see you. Bethesda, Maryland. David's from Tijuana, Ireland, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Great. Dallas, Texas, Nashville, Ottawa, Guatemala. Oh my God, Concord, Mass. We've got incredibly diverse logins here today. All right, thanks for joining, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna just start. We are now at 10:03. Let's see here. Los Angeles, Pennsylvania, Vancouver. Cool. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to Focus on the Stories 2020 International Virtual Photo Festival. Today's webinar, I'm bringing Hong Kong's struggle for democracy to a global audience, is one of 17 virtual webinars, discussions that we've hosted over the last 2.5 months. Focus on the Story is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit. And it's founded on the driving principle that photography can spark meaningful conversations at the intersection of policy, civic engagement, and visual storytelling. Today's discussion on the role that photojournalists and their photos are playing in helping Hong Kong's pro-democracy activists tell their story is going to take us deep into each of these areas. We will have time for discussion, so please ask questions in the Q&A box that you see there. And also send us a chat if you're having technical issues or want to make some other comment. But questions could go in the Q&A box. And during the discussion period, if you're comfortable with it, I'll unmute you and allow you to ask your question live, or I can read it out. You can just let me know when you ask the question. So to get us started, I want to just take 2 minutes current history to get us oriented to these protests. This is going to be really, really broad brushstrokes, so apologies for missing out on a lot of the details. But Hong Kong was a British colony for 156 years before the Brits handed over Hong Kong to China in 1997. And China agreed to allow Hong Kong to function mostly on its own for the next 50 years, which would take us to the year 2047. But despite that agreement, China has consistently eroded many of the basic tenets of Hong Kong's legal system. And so Hong Kong citizens have taken to the streets. One of the only forms of protest they have, since the ballot box is not a meaningful way to make change in the current system. Many of you remember the 2014 protests that were in response to changes to the basic law that stripped away many of those voting rights. Those protests, which lasted 79 days, became famously known as the umbrella movement for the protesters' clever use of umbrellas to shield themselves from tear gas and surveillance cameras. And I think Laurel's gonna hopefully show us some of her photos from there as well. Early last year, protesters hit the street again when China tried to put in place a new extradition law. And those protests never really stopped. But they still use umbrellas to protect themselves, but they've also adopted Bruce Lee's advice to be like water as they continue this months-long effort to push back against China's encroachment on their freedoms. So here we are in June 2020, and we have two great photojournalists to give us the inside scoop on how they have covered these protests. I first want to introduce our speakers. Laurel Chor is an award-winning freelance visual journalist and National Geographic explorer from Hong Kong. In 2019, she's worked with numerous publications, including the New York Times, National Geographic, Getty, AFP, Reuters, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. And then we also have Leah Millis, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. She's a senior photographer with Thomson Reuters, and she's covered the Hong Kong protests in 2019 as part of Reuters' Pulitzer Prize winning team, and we're happy that she has joined us today. She also has some incredible photo essays up on her website, and I encourage you to visit both of Laurel and Leah's IGs and their websites to see the full range of their work. So at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen and allow Laurel to start sharing hers and to kick us off.
Great, thank you. Let me share. Oh, I can't share my screen.
You can't, okay. Let's figure that out, hold on.
Working on it.
Okay.
I'll just start talking first. Thank you for having me. Looks like I can share my screen now. I'm a photojournalist from and based in Hong Kong. I've been covering the protests. I did start covering the protests in 2014. I'm actually not showing any of my work from there. It's so long ago, but
I know, it feels like a long time ago.
I know, right? 6 years ago. But I'll show you some of my work from over last year. I can't believe it's been a year. It's been actually almost exactly a year since the protests began in earnest. The 1-year anniversary of the first march, which organizers say 1 million attended, was on June 9th. And the 2 million person march, at least according to organizers, estimates that the anniversary was yesterday. So a lot of nostalgia right now, and a lot of people reflecting on what we've what Hong Kong's been through the last year, so it's very timely. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. So this photograph I took almost a year ago in July. This was from a protest. So a week before this protest, there was this horrific attack by these masked gangsters on an MTR train. MTRs are subway. So these men wielding bats and knives attacked people on the subway, which is a very, considered a safe place, of course. And they attacked just commuters and protesters, and the police didn't respond for, I think, about half an hour, basically letting the attack happen. And the police were actually later photographed with some of those men talking to them. So this protest happened a week later in the same neighborhood in response to that, blaming the police for their inaction. And I saw this woman, she was yelling at the police, she was really angry. And I just thought it was the police didn't really know what to do with her, and they were marching forward as this was happening, and they kind of swallowed her up. And I was going backwards and taking this. And I posted on Twitter because another video surfaced of her yelling at protesters. And because she was telling them to just go home. I think she just wanted, no one to get hurt. And I tweeted it, and it sort of went a little bit viral from there. And that was the first time I really realized, just the impact that our work can have as photojournalists, and how many, it was quite humbling to realize how many eyes saw it, what it meant to people. I saw a lot of people share it. I've had friends, I saw friends who saw it who didn't realize I took it. So that was quite a big moment for me, for realizing just the power our work can have. This was from that very first march on June 9th last year. At the time, it was the most people I had ever seen in one place. It's quite remarkable and emotional to see that. I think no matter where you stand on these issues, it's very moving to see so many people united, marching peacefully for one cause. You saw, kids, babies, and elderly people. And, in the next week, there were double the number of people on the streets. And for context, 1 million or 2 people, or even 700,000 people, this is only a city of 7.5 million. So it's a significant percentage of the population out on the streets. So the protests began peacefully. They had those 2 marches. And Hong Kong does have a long history of peaceful protest. And Hong Kong is generally a very safe city. So for me to see Hong Kong sort of descend into violence, on certain days in certain neighborhoods, it was quite shocking. So this is from a neighborhood that I used to live in. And as you can see, there's a lot of residential and office buildings around. And this was the sort of scene you would see. On one side, you'd have protesters, and this was early on, so they're not quite that geared up. It's like simple construction helmets, simple masks, and umbrellas. And then on the other side, you'll see a front line like this with the police, riot shields, again, on these very typically Hong Kong streets. It was quite striking to see that kind of violence happening in these normally very calm neighborhoods. Like I was just in this neighborhood yesterday. So here, this is when it started getting pretty violent. You can see on the ground there's bricks. So the protesters were throwing bricks at them, and the police were advancing and protecting themselves. Tear gas, a lot of tear gas was used. I'm not sure what the final count has been. I want to say in the last year, they've fired like 16,000 canisters of tear gas, a lot of tear gas, to the point that, they started putting out studies, like an animal shelter organization put out this like cartoon PSA about what to do if your pet was exposed to tear gas. There's been journalists especially, who've been hospitalized for excessive tear gas exposure, because we're talking week after week for hours at a time. And Hong Kong is very densely populated. A lot of people are going to these protests. It was just a lot of exposure. And Hong Kong, the umbrellas became the movement of the icon of the pro-democracy movement, and people did really use them. They're actually, pretty effective considering what they are and what they're using them for. This is from, I want to say, August last year. This is in a more industrial neighborhood. This is right in front of the legislative, this is near a police building and near government buildings. And this is one of the more violent days. I believe this is August 31st. And so you can see on the ground, it's blue, and on the piece of metal behind, it's blue as well. So that's from the water cannons. So besides tear gas, another risk was the water cannons, which they laced with the blue dye, and also pepper spray chemical. So it was really painful. I think not long after I took this photo, I got completely doused in the spray. A friend saw me get hit, and he said it looked like they were actually aiming for the back of my neck. I was completely soaked, and it was one of the most painful experiences of my life. And I know other people who got hit worse, and it's just so much pain that you literally feel like you're dying. You know you're not dying, but it's just so much pain and you're burning and you can't really work, and water barely helps. There are a lot of brutal arrests. Here, I guess here they're not doing it yet, but looks like there's a lot of kneeling on protesters in Hong Kong, which is why, and Leah's been covering this and she'll be able to talk about this a little bit, but seeing the brutality on protesters in the US, it's almost weird for us who've been covering Hong Kong for so long, because you see the same brutality, you see the same techniques, the same very brutal arrests. There are also a lot of peaceful protests. That's something that gets lost in the coverage internationally. Of course, if it bleeds, it leads, but a lot of peaceful protests. So this was a protest against a ban on face masks in Hong Kong. The chief executive, the leader of the city, banned face coverings in illegal gatherings, and people were protesting that, and they wore face masks naturally. And this is in Central, which is the financial hub of Hong Kong. The center of Hong Kong, which is the financial hub. This was a human chain. There were a lot of human chains. The interesting thing about the Hong Kong protests is, again, despite the violence, there are a lot of peaceful protests. And even if a lot of protesters, like the frontliners who are doing the violent things, throwing Molotovs, even if they don't agree with the peaceful methods, since time and time again it hasn't worked, they'll still show solidarity with them and they'll still participate. I remember, I think for this human chain, there were posts in the forums that protesters used to organize them saying, I know it's lame, but we have to go and support them. And another thing to note is that in the Hong Kong protests, for some reason, Pepe the Frog has become a symbol for the movement. I know it's an alt-right symbol in the US. I know for a lot of people it's jarring. I know for Leah it was really weird to see, because it usually means there's white supremacists around. But for whatever reason in Hong Kong, it's somehow become a mascot for the protests. This is another peaceful protest. This was also in Central. This was a rally organized by civil servants. It started raining, so they naturally opened umbrellas, and the protests in Hong Kong is already a very photogenic place. It's a very visual place, and protesters definitely are very media savvy, and they know what looks good, and they know what attracts attention and what makes good photos that can catch, headlines, and that's what also, I think, what makes the protests interesting to capture, is that they know they're very media aware, basically. Another strange thing about the protest for me was just seeing the violence spill into very glitzy areas where you would never imagine there to be anything like this. Hong Kong is already a very safe place, but to see these neighborhoods specifically descend into that shows just how far the protests went, and just how fragile in a way society is. So this is in Central, again. It's like the richest, fanciest part of Hong Kong. And here, these people are not even really in gear. This is during a lunchtime protest that the police used tear gas on. So you can see, like, that's a Louis Vuitton on the left of it. That's Tiffany's, that blue. This man throwing a brick onto the road. He's wearing a suit. And that also was, you could really see how, the pro-democracy movement is often said to be, young people, maybe disenfranchised people, but during these kinds of protests, the lunchtime protests in these areas, you could really see how much broad support the protests actually had, and how they cut across social classes. Probably the most notable event for me was the siege of Palau, which I'm really glad I got to experience that with Leah. It's always nice having a buddy around when you go through these things. But Leah and I were both at Palau. So Palau is Polytechnic University. And during this period, there were a few battles, really, between the police and students and protesters at universities. And this university in particular was actually quite important because it overlooks the entrance to the Cross Harbor Tunnel. It's the tunnel that connects Hong Kong Island with Kowloon, the other side. And there's walkways from the campus going over the tunnel entrance. And the protesters actually successfully blocked off the tunnel, and the tunnel couldn't be used for a few weeks, actually. There are 2 other tunnels, but that's the main one. And the police ended up besieging the campus. Anyone who left would be arrested and could be charged with rioting, which carries up to a 10-year sentence. So people kind of were just stuck inside. So there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of fire. One of the scarier moments for me was when we were inside and something happened, and really early in the morning, and I think the police were trying to come in, so the protesters set the entrances on fire. So we're all trapped inside behind these walls of fire, which thankfully eventually were under control, but this is sort of the aftermath of the main entrance fire. One of the more violent scenes I saw was when protesters decided to make a break for it. After the police declared the siege, protesters decided that their best bet was just to run out en masse, like hundreds, if not maybe over 1,000 of them just running out all at once. And it was most and utter chaos. The police sort of blindsided them, and it was really, really messy and scary. So this is most of the protesters, those who were not arrested, they actually turned around and climbed back onto campus. And there were a lot of really brutal arrests. This is a girl being dragged by the police. And this is afterwards, and everyone at this point, journalist, protester, police officer, I'm sure, were just exhausted, and everyone was just sleep deprived for days. And you were stuck inside this campus, you had cabin fever, and so this kid who is laying across the steps, you can actually see he's soaked in blue, so he's probably in pain, but he's blue because he got hit by the water cannon, and he's sleeping in front of a tray of Molotov cocktails. There were Molotov cocktails everywhere. They turned this campus into a Molotov cocktail factory, and like true to Hong Kong protester fashion, they actually were pouring out beer into these big tubs and throwing them away because no one was drinking them, and they just needed to make Molotov cocktails. So it was a very surreal experience, and I was in there for about a week. A lot of protesters managed to escape. A lot of protesters did get arrested trying to escape. But so you started getting these surreal scenes a few days in so this gym used to be full of protesters, like almost like a refugee camp in a way, with mats on the floor, clothes. And as people left, it became a ghost town, and here there's only one guy left. So I had a lot of time to explore campus, and nothing was really happening after the drama of the first few days, and I started venturing further out. I came across this no man's land where I found a lot of backpacks and a lot of abandoned things. And my theory is, and I'm pretty sure of this, is that protesters would come to this no man's land. It was sort of outside the main area of where the students were, but also not somewhere the police ventured to. And I realized that there are actually a few exits there where you could make a run for it.
I think we've got a little bit of a lag in Laurel's video or audio. Let's see. Do we still have Laurel?
Yeah, she seems frozen.
Okay. All right. We'll wait just a second. I'm sure she'll come back. Thanks we've got one question in the question box. If anybody wants to put them in, we'll probably won't take questions right away, but we will take them after Leah speaks. All right, let's give Laurel about 15 more seconds, and if she can't get the audio back, it looks like she's going to log back in. So let's wait just 1 second. Otherwise, if she's having trouble getting back in, then Leah will head over to you and let Laurel finish up after that.
Pretty wild seeing her photos
Yeah. I didn't
during
know
this time.
I didn't know that y'all were together at the siege of Poly-U. That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I got there right after the battle happened.
Okay. Yeah, that's that. I mean, that just it looked insane.
Yeah.
And I actually wanted to ask her like how they got food because they were there for what, a week or so, I think, right? Or like,
It was an incredible part of the whole thing was the amount of organizing around donations
okay.
and people like cooking who in the cafeteria and
Hi.
there she is.
Sorry. Okay.
We're just
I'm almost done.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't know what
Keep
happened.
going.
Okay. Oh, I have to be allowed to share my screen again.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, cancel. Share. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So yes, this is a girl's backpack, I would guess. There's lip gloss, change of clothes. Another sort of thing, and see this sort of increasing.
Wow.
I don't want to say militarization of the gear, but I mean in Hong Kong there's a very strong paintball culture, so you could see a lot of paintball gear being used, and sometimes you kind of feel like these kids are just, it's like a game for them. For some of them, I think it was interesting to sort of get an idea of who they were and all the things they left behind, and I'll never find out really if they made it out or not. So this is from the last major march, probably on December 31st, I believe. Or no, it was in early December. It was one of the last big marches that happened. So even in December, there was still the momentum for these really huge events that brought out a lot of peaceful protesters. And we haven't really seen that this year. So, for us, the COVID epidemic actually began way back in January. So, this was in December, and then in January, the virus became a concern. And ever since then, it's sort of calmed down. I think between the virus and the fact that a lot of protesters got arrested, I think over 8,000 people have been arrested. So people are afraid of getting arrested again. People are also injured and tired. Everyone's just really tired. So I think there's a lot of fatigue morally and physically. And we haven't seen that momentum again. But in Hong Kong, the virus is actually not gone, but we have just over 1,000 cases. And I think, in the last month, we probably have only had about, I want to say around 10 cases. So people aren't really afraid of that anymore. And now we're seeing protests starting up again. But I don't know if we'll ever see the same kind of momentum we did last year. So I'll end on this photo. This is from June 4th this year, just earlier this month. This is from, so June 4th is the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. And every year Hong Kong has this huge commemoration for the anniversary. And this year is canceled. I mean, the police wouldn't give authorization because of the virus. So of course, a lot of people said it was for political reasons. But people showed up anyway, and surprisingly, the police didn't actually do anything. They let it happen. So I think even the police knew that it would look really bad to crack down on an event to commemorate the Tiananmen massacre. So the spirit's still there, but with the national security law, I think people feel maybe more hopeless than ever. For the first time ever, there's a call for independence that is getting more mainstream. Before, is very much considered a fringe demand, but now you'll hear it routinely at every protest. So that's sort of where the movement's going now. There's also a lot more unions organizing, people trying to affect change that way. But we're still really in the thick of it. So please keep following the Hong Kong story. I know there's a lot going around everywhere in the world right now, but I think this is a story that is going to be really important, not just for this region, but really to help the world understand how China is going to deal with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel. That's, amazing photos, and the stories behind them are, it's really been heartbreaking to watch the trajectory of what's going on in Hong Kong. And there was one clarifying question from somebody in the chat, and it was about the backpacks. And you said you found them in this no man's land. Why were they ditched there, do you think?
So I think, so when protesters made a run for it, and there were some insane stories coming out of that university. So one thing that happened was, at one point there was an escape that seems like it came out of a movie script. Basically, there's this pedestrian bridge over a highway, and protesters tied together fire hoses and rappelled down this bridge onto the highway, where there were motorcycles and scooters waiting for them to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And that was crazy. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't have believed it. And then a whole bunch of protesters also escaped through the sewage system. They climbed down into the sewage tunnels and actually crawled their way out of campus and resurfaced elsewhere. And I think the backpacks that I found were people who belonged to people who left them behind before who probably tried to crawl out at night or something. Because if you were caught outside of campus with nothing on you, then I think the case against you was weaker. Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing these people just abandoned everything, and also would probably hinder their escape. So I think they just left everything behind before they made a run for it, and I have no idea if they made it or not. No idea.
Great. All right, thanks. All right, Leah, let's turn to you. Hopefully you can share your screen. And Laurel might need to, yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Laurel covered all of it, and we're good.
We'll just go home now, yeah.
But I will share a little bit of what I did. I was there for almost a month. It was November through early December. So I got there literally right after the siege happened. And how do I share screen? Okay. So it was actually really crazy to be following Laurel's reporting and then just see her say, oh, whoa, hello. I just crashed it. Hold on. And then to come across her at PolyU, I think that's when we saw each other first. And it was pretty trippy.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Did you guys know each other before?
We had just met actually in DC.
Yeah, we had met in January, or was it June?
I don't know. It was I think it was in the fall. I'm sorry, my whole thing just crashed.
That's okay.
You
want me to give you 30 seconds? Because
let me unshare this.
And then
how do I unshare it? Stop share.
Yep.
Okay,
Laurel,
sorry. Let me just look for this.
Yeah, no worries. Laurel, there was a question that came in about were the police in Hong Kong targeting journalists, as happened, as we've seen, has been happening here in the US, where it feels like they're targeting journalists specifically. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, I think for sure it's been a big concern. The Hong Kong Journalists Association and the Foreign Correspondents Club have actually met with the police several times about it. It's been pretty bad. I mean, I've definitely, you get verbal abuse, you know, like accusing you of being a fake journalist. You get physical abuse, you get shoved back. I know people have been kicked, hit with batons. There was one time when I pretty much got personally tear gassed. We were on an empty street where protesters were literally, me and my colleagues were literally there standing, just talking about where to go eat because we were done. And we didn't have gear on or anything. And all of a sudden the police fired tear gas. And, you know, that was definitely targeted. And they were basically just messing around with us. And, you know, they marched down and pushed us one side and then pushed us to another side. And they actually surrounded us with riot shields. It was just like 6 of us. So you do see that kind of targeting. And there's a lot of video evidence. I mean, there's videos of, there's a police officer who punched a journalist, a lot of pepper spray. Recently, a police officer saw a white reporter, assumed they were from America, and actually started chanting, Black Lives Matter, I can't breathe. So he was mocking, you know, taunting this journalist but, you know, mocking the Black Lives Matter protests. So you do see a lot of very unprofessional behavior like that. It is a problem for sure. And so one thing that we saw in Hong Kong last year that we're now seeing in the US is, it's been over a year now that police don't show their badge numbers. So there's no accountability. And it's quite scary to see that happening in the US as well. I think Leah's ready.
Yeah, I found it.
Great.
So share the screen again. Okay. So I showed up, really the way that we covered this event with Reuters was, we just put a lot of people on the story, and we were, you know, being a staffer, really lucky to be a part of that team. And I just want to emphasize something that Laurel wouldn't talk about really, is just how hard she was working. And like, I mean, you could just see it from her constant like Instagram coverage. Like, it wasn't just photos, like she was doing video and reporting, and that's like really hard to sustain. And she's kind of her own team. So, you know, she was working with other teams, but like she wasn't a staffer who could, you know, have relief come in. So that's really what I was. I came in to help relieve some of, especially like my local colleagues who had been working, you know, like Laurel for months, and really needed a break. So honestly, like I got there right after the siege, and then I was there through that massive march, and it was fairly, like, for Hong Kong, quiet, but it was also very typical, I think, of like the you know, the peaceful protesting that happened. And I think a lot of that, our coverage was just like, okay, we're going to go cover this and this and this. And it didn't really even matter how big it was. And I think that was really crucial, because it just showed all the little moments in between, and it allowed for us to continue like a continuous reporting on the story. And I don't know. I mean, everybody remembers the horrible violence, which is a good reason, but I would venture to say that the reason why it had so much momentum was because like so many people were involved. You know, people who couldn't even go out there were donating their time and their places and food and stuff. And we're actually seeing a lot of parallels with that in the US. So anyway, sorry, that was like a little rant, tangent. So a lot of times, you know, they're holding up their hands to show the 5 demands that the protesters were calling for. You know, really like a leaderless movement, but really organized in terms of like what exactly they were demanding. And it was just like, it was so emotional, no matter like what. You would find at least, you know, a few people at any protest who were clearly just like really touched and like affected by what was going on. This is actually at the big march that we went to that didn't really have anything major happen. And I didn't even realize till later that the gun he was pointing was a real gun. It wasn't a less lethal weapon. So it just goes to show, like, you also just never know, like, what's going to go down. Also, just a little, like, side point, look at, like, what he's wearing on his forearm. That's very similar to some of the stuff we were finding at PolyU on the ground. It was, like, the incredible, like, quality sometimes of the gear that they had was, like, really impressive. So showing up to PolyU, that was a really difficult reporting assignment, especially if you didn't have people to come and help out. So the police, they started allowing at least journalism institutions to like rotate people out. They had like a list, and you had to show like a lot of identification, and so some people could rotate people out if they had someone. So I came in, and you're basically sleeping in there. And I came into this little bureau that they had, Laurel and others had kind of created in like a former classroom. So people were sleeping on like yoga mats. And the odd thing is you could like find almost anything you needed just by wandering around the campus, because there was so much stuff like donated or that was there. Like if you needed water, you could just go find like an unopened bottle of water somewhere. It was bizarre because it was like post-apocalypse, but the power and water still worked. So it was really hard to describe, like, and then you could just like remnants of the battle were just everywhere, and of like, I mean, everywhere. Like we went around campus looking for, the part of this story was we were looking for anybody who was still hiding there, because, they were facing years in jail, and these are kids, they were terrified. And so we were wandering around campus, and it was like, this was a big campus, and it was almost like you could go anywhere and you would find some remnants of what had happened, like whether that be like a glove, or like in some places like tents where people have been sleeping, or like a razor that someone was using to like shave their face, or like just it was kind of that, even just like not being there, I could see the massive effects of what had happened there just by wandering around the campus. And this is the spot that had burned that we saw earlier. There were a lot of like people trying to come in from volunteer organizations. Some people thought some of them were undercover police trying to convince and find protesters and tell them to surrender. Anybody who worked there knows this man who he was having a time. He wore a spoon, like almost like a sword. He was a cook. He cooked for a lot of people, and he had a really rough time during the end there. A lot of mental health stuff really caught up with people. It was just a really rough time for the people left on campus. So there was like following a party looking for protesters, trying to convince them to come out. A couple of them did. They surrendered, and honestly, right now a lot of them are getting charges now, or their trials are happening. Is that right?
Yeah, they've sort of been trickling through the cases.
Yeah, so people, it's really devastating
now.
Yeah, I mean, these are young lives, and some of them were just trapped, like they couldn't get off campus because of how chaotic it was. And some people, like, I don't know, like how much, it's like some people knew what they were getting into kind of, and then others just ended up being trapped there. And like, these are young people's lives that are being changed forever. So yeah, lots of Molotov cocktails. I mean, it's hard to describe just how many there were. They were in the factory area. It was basically like an outdoor breezeway. And even though it was outside, if you were like standing around that area for too long, you start to feel sick because of the all the chemicals and stuff. And so even like in the battle area where like along the kind of like, I would assume the front line, where you'd see like the blue chemical stuff that Laurel was talking about getting like from the cannons. If you like, I went over there just photograph items I was finding. Like even just standing over there days afterward, I felt sick after just standing there because of the amount of chemicals. And I would assume like from that, whatever substance that is that they sprayed on people. So occasionally like a representative would come out, and as you can see, like, you know, completely hide their face to talk about the protesters who were left. This is reminding me a lot of what we're seeing right now in DC, of like messages and, you know, just, I mean, personal notes to like posters. There's a really big art movement that has happened. Really amazing art and like video production, which has been pretty impressive from the Hong Kong movement. A little bit of fire. So again, like this was just from one of those small protests one night. There were a lot more people who would, you know, have kids or be older, feel a little bit like more safe, but wanted to come out and support. And yeah, the like linking of hands. I think this was considered small, but it took me like 10 minutes to walk down to the very end of the chain. I remember. Again, this is my photo that ended up in the entry for the Pulitzer, and this is a really, like, some people go into these situations, especially like people who parachute in, and they're just kind of want to go to what they think is going to be the most exciting or the most like explosive or whatever, because that's what they're there for. And the thing is that there's so many moments that can be missed. And I think going to the smaller gatherings, to the ones that are really like community centric and really like organized by people who are involved in the movement. And I'm thinking about American stuff here as well. Like that's where you'll find a lot of like really just kind of powerful moments that I think speak to the heart of the issue, more than just like the police beating people, which is also a big problem, but it's so much bigger than that, you know? Also, the mask thing is just, there's so many like weird parallels going on. Also, I did just like some other smaller stories. This is a journalist who lost her eye to, I don't know if it was it was a less than lethal
Rubber bullet.
munition. It was a rubber bullet. And we're seeing that here in the US now. So she was kind enough, she's like spoken to every media outlet to do another portrait for me. So I went to like a pro-US rally, and that was really weird. It was just kind of crazy. Like, I'll just say that in the US, if you go to a rally where you see a lot of American flags, you expect a different kind of vibe. But it was really interesting because there was a lot of hope for the US supporting the protests, and there was some lip service to that, but we'll see at the end of the day how far that actually goes. And then I just want to transition to the flag in this one, because that feels like it could have been photographed in the US. This is just a little protest for Simon Chen. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He was someone who claimed to be tortured by the Chinese government. He disappeared. He was a consular staffer, and he alleged that he was hung, handcuffed, and shackled and beaten when he failed to comply with the authorities. So there's just a lot of like different like aspects to this story that are much more nuanced than a lot of the stuff we saw internationally. I mean, generally. So this was kind of bizarre. The PLA barracks were across the street from PolyU, and some of us kind of thought maybe that's why they never cut the power, or because it might have been on the same grid. If they had cut the power, they wouldn't have been able to stay in there, I don't think, as long as they were able to. So the weird thing is that we saw them a couple times. We saw them practicing with like SWAT gear, which was a bad sign because they're not supposed to deploy at all. And then, although they did come out at one point in like running shorts, remember, like, I can't remember what the timeline was on that, but they came out to like clean up.
Yeah. They volunteered to clean up.
Yeah. So that was bizarre, but anyway, so they're right across the street. And so you could hear them chanting. And I honestly, I'm not sure, but I kind of think it was really on purpose, like as an intimidation, because I saw them several times. They would just line them up and face them towards the campus, and then they would have them go through these like chants. And it was just really eerie, like, because you'd be on this empty campus and then you can hear the chanting. And just as a side note, this is like a 17-story building with no working elevators, so I got a really good workout every time.
There was an elevator, you just didn't find it.
No, it didn't work. We found both of them. By the time I was there, it didn't work. It didn't work. Trust me. I did not want to do that hike. She doesn't believe me. So it was amazing to just witness in December the amount of people who came out. I think there was question as to whether there was still this amount of support at that time, because of all the like violence and how it had affected the economy. And there was just kind of a lot of speculation. And I think the elections and then this massive, peaceful, incredible march really just kind of solidified what this movement means to people. So we also did a story about people who met and like fell in love and became couples while being frontline protesters. And I somehow convinced these two to come to my hotel room and do a portrait. So they're laying on my hotel room bed. And they were really sweet about it. So yeah, those are my Hong Kong photos. I don't know if we want to just do a quick like comparison, or I don't know. Do we have time?
Yeah, let's go ahead and segue into that, because I think when we open it up for discussion, we can kind of bring in what's happening now, with in the US, and draw any parallels. Yeah, go for it.
And I also like want to make sure that we don't take away from Hong Kong, because it's really, really bad what's going on there. So I do wonder, like, if this movement is going to breathe life or not life, but like help kind of encourage protesters in Hong Kong, I wonder, because like I'm seeing a lot of like the protesters here have learned a lot from the tactics of the Hong Kong protesters, and there's just a really interesting like kind of solidarity between them. So we'll see about that. So this is just like some images from the last few weeks. The beginning is in Minneapolis, of some of the stuff going on here. Just like a lot of parallels.
It's almost like the police handbook is the same, you know, with the insane amounts of tear gas and.
I actually, there's a lot of different dynamics in this, like being like a white Westerner in Hong Kong gave me an extra like level of protection, I think. But, you know, so in terms of like arrest and like being jailed, like that's scarier over there, but I'm more afraid of US police in terms of the tactics that they use. But the tear gas is worse in Hong Kong. It's like,
really?
Yeah. It's like they were using the Chinese stuff over there.
Yeah.
So it's like our correspondents, I don't know if you ever had this, but our correspondents were getting like rashes. But something that was actually helpful to everyone else now is that they figured out like what the best gas masks were. So we all learned from that. This is the photo that made me think of Laurel's photo.
Even the cane.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just like he had just been actually tear gassed probably 10 minutes before that. So this is one of my favorite photos that I took, and this is again a moment that happened just an afternoon at the memorial site, you know, just like nothing scheduled necessarily. But it was just like one of the most electric, like powerful things I've ever witnessed. It started pouring rain, and these young people just like were just standing in the road just chanting and chanting. They just kept chanting like George Floyd's name, and that, you know, a chant with convicting the rest of the officers. And there was like thunder and lightning, and it was just like super powerful. And I was like, my cameras might die, but that's okay, because like it was just an amazing moment to be in. Yeah, so, and then, you know, going between Minneapolis and DC, this is an interesting thing we're starting to see more and more of, is like white people going to the front to protect the people of color. And as you see on the left, the girl was terrified and sobbing, but she did stay. So this is in DC. Those guys are sitting on the ground with their hands up. So yeah, that's kind of just a little bit of the parallels stuff going on.
Thanks for that. There's quite a few questions. I mean, and so we've got from the you know, questions around gear, and like you mentioned, you know, that you found out the best gas mask, and then curious, you know, one question was, okay, you're wearing a gas mask. Does that change how you can be a photojournalist, or is it, you know, I assume it makes it harder? Laurel, how have you transitioned to having to, do you wear it most of the time if you're in Hong Kong at the protest? You're up on mute.
A gas mask?
Yeah, gas mask. Yeah.
So I'll always, you know, it's before every protest, it's like you kind of do a risk assessment, right? Like, because the gear is heavy, and it holds you back a little bit, but you also don't want to be caught without it. For example, the Tiananmen Memorial, like, because it was no longer authorized and technically didn't have organizers anymore, that people are just going to show up in like candles, or what if the police show up? But in the end, you kind of just always bring it with you and just put it away in your backpack. And hope you don't need to use it. I've had to use this year so far, I've had to wear it once. I mean, I took a few months off, so I've only been back and working for about a month now, or not even. And the one time I would have needed one, it was still in my backpack. So I just caught a bit of pepper ball cloud in my face. So you just always have it with you. And so the beginning we just had like half face masks with goggles, but those goggles, you need something that forms a seal around your face for tear gas, really. And once you're hit with tear gas, you're out of commission for like 20 minutes at least. Like, you cannot work, you can't see, you're completely helpless. So you really don't want that to happen, and it's just very unpleasant. So then everyone started moving to full face masks, those 3M full face clear masks, and those work really well. But then after Vebi Mega Indah, the Indonesian journalist, lost her eye, and there's actually also a protester who lost her eye the same way. That's when we started getting really worried about getting hit in the face. So that's when I got a ballistic face mask. So that's what I carry around with me. And then I'll also have just these protective goggles that Reuters gives to all their staff. And that, I mean, like in a tear gas situation, that's not going to help you, but it's like in a situation where there's not tear gas, but just in case there's like projectiles, of course, you want to protect your eyes. And it's also helpful if there's pepper spray, because that can really be unpredictable. Just, a trigger happy police officer.
Yeah. I think I don't have much to add to that, except for that depending on who you're working for and what your resources are, like my company often requires us to wear vests as well. So you're kind of like having to judge like how much stuff to bring out. And nowadays it's like I always have a helmet and a gas mask in a backpack, keep it in the backpack so as not to like escalate the situation or make myself a target. But when you honestly, if you're going to get one and you're going to work with one, you got to try it on and get used to it before you're out in the field, because like photographing with, depending on what kind of mask you have, like mine is kind of like a bubble. And so you can't like hold the camera like right up to where you're used to holding it. I mean, with like Sony's, that might be easier, but it is a little bit harder, but honestly, like it's much better than getting maced or tear gassed. Like I had to do that for 4 years working at a different place without that, and it's so much better to have it.
Do you take less gear because you're carrying more of this protective gear with you, less camera gear?
Yeah. But also like you're just going to be out, these things last for hours. Like you have to think about it like you're going, I don't know, on like a hike or something. Like you have to like think about your water and like where, like if you need a bathroom, especially if you're a woman, that was an issue in Minneapolis. And right now it's even worse because like the pandemic, and then like everyone's freaked out. So they've all like boarded everything up. So like you have to like pre-plan everything. And yeah, so I had a lot of amazing neighbors in Minneapolis like offer their homes to me, like for a base, which I didn't use because of pandemic, but it was nice.
So we have Laura, do you want to answer about the gear question? It would be, and then I'm going to unmute Michelle Egan. I'm going to get you teed up to ask your question live if you're ready. But Laura, what's your, like on your gear, do you pare down because you're carrying a bunch of other stuff too?
Yeah, I mean, like Leah said, you're basically like some days, you know, it's like, okay, I might be out for 12 plus hours. And you already have the protection gear. So for almost all of last year, I actually I actually just started shooting with one body, one lens. I would take one or two other lenses in my backpack, but I would just use them so rarely. So I basically shot 99% of the time on a 24-70 because it was really all I needed. And like, you really have to, it's cost benefit analysis, and you also have to really budget your energy. According to my Garmin, on some days I'm doing 30,000 steps, and you're running, you're chasing after police, you're chasing after protesters, and often it's a full sprint. So even if you can carry all that stuff, you're going to be slowed down a lot. And carrying water too. So I use a Camelback, which is way easier with a gas mask, and Hong Kong's really hot and most of the protests last year were in the summer, so you're talking like 90+% humidity, 30 degrees Celsius, whatever that is in Fahrenheit. It's really hot, so you really have to think about how you can survive the day. And for me, 2 bodies was not worth it. Like, I realized, the days I did bring out 2 bodies, I would take maybe 3 photos on my second body. So you just have to trust your ability with one body. That's what I did, at least.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Michelle, I have unmuted you. Do you want to ask your question live?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, first of all, Laurel and Leah, for those amazing photos. I am curious, in particular for Laurel, how do you separate between your personal investment, your personal involvement in the issues from your sort of journalistic professional responsibilities to document the event? What's the sort of the fine line between these two things? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. It's something I struggle with all the time. I think, on one hand, of course, you have, I think ultimately you have to remember, for me, I have to remind myself, you're there to do a job. And I think one thing that's helpful is, the protesters understand the importance of the media. And I think in the beginning, there were some issues with protesters maybe being hostile to media because we were photographing them doing illegal things, like breaking into the legislature, vandalizing things. But, they've sort of realized through some sort of, consensus that they have to let us do our jobs. And if they don't want to be seen doing something, they have to cover their own faces. Or they do this thing where they go, "It's raining." And then everyone around opens up umbrellas. They just hear that. And they're like, "Oh, it's raining." And they open umbrellas and they hide whatever vandalism they're doing. So I just have to remind myself to do my job. And of course it's very emotional. It's to witness this happening to your home in slow motion, but also fast forward it's really hard. But at the same time, I think I realized that as a storyteller, part of what I can offer to the conversation is the fact that I am from here, and it is my home. And I think that's, a perspective I can bring to such an internationally covered story. So it is really hard to separate that. But I think, as a journalist, you always have to, for me, it's the truth. I try to remind myself, what I'm there to do is to tell the truth. And sometimes, most of the time power doesn't like that, but also some of the times protesters don't like that. And every side wants you to tell their side of the story. And I'm just trying to do my best to tell the truth, because I think this truth will serve society the best. I think that helps to answer. But it's very hard, and there's a lot of crying involved. Even if I think you're not from here, I think the protests are really emotional. Seeing Leah's pictures, it's and seeing the pictures from the U.S., it's very moving and powerful and touching.
Yeah, and there was an anonymous question just about that, about emotional health, how, like, what sort of coping strategies you might have, or things that you do to make sure that you're, taking care of yourself emotionally.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle for everyone. I mean, that's why I'm really glad to have peers like Leah to reach out to. I think, two
Likewise.
phrases, two phrases I always come back to is protect the asset, which is something this leadership coach that I've taken courses from always says, you're your best asset, you're your only asset, and you have to protect yourself in order to be able to do your work. And that's rest, that's sleep, that's nutrition, that's exercise, that's everything you need to do to maintain yourself. And also rest is resistance. I think when you're covering these sort of movements, there's a lot of, I think, guilt and anxiety about always having to cover everything and working all the time because this is so important and you want to do your job. But you have to remember that letting yourself getting worn down doesn't help anyone, and taking care of yourself is part of the greater cause for whatever open, transparent, fair society. So nothing novel or innovative, is just sleep, nutrition, exercise, and time with friends, and time doing normal things. And for me personally, I'm like a very scarily good compartmentalizer. I don't know if it's a good thing.
Okay.
But yeah,
Can I add to that?
Yeah,
I love like stepping on a mental health soapbox. So I wish that every single U.S. journalist who is now like in the midst of everything that we're going through over here could listen to what you're saying, because Hong Kong is, it's in many ways, it's like you guys are like first and we're following on many things. And obviously we're seeing where they diverge in terms of like all different aspects of it. But talking about just as journalists and covering this, like y'all covered, I mean, just, months, it's been a year now. And like, that's a long time. It's not only like emotionally taxing, but it's like physically taxing. These kids have boundless energy and they will just go in the US, like even they'll go into like 3 a.m. But I think one thing that, other than everything that you said, that I kind of realized a few years ago with a therapist that I was working with that actually works, is coming up with like what we call the pre-trauma plan, which is like, that you're potentially going into a space that's going to either traumatize or re-traumatize you. Like, let's say, you're going to be covering a big protest day. So you can literally like plan around that. So you can like make sure that you're getting significant amount of sleep and water, the right nutrition, like leading up to it. And then you can like schedule in your recovery days afterward, because like your brain needs sleep to heal from the trauma that it's been exposed to. And so you really need sleep afterwards. So you can actually schedule your mental health care, which fits into your physical health care as well. But you can actually schedule it in to, make sure that you're going to be able to keep doing it, because resiliency is like the most important tool that we have as journalists. And we, just looking at the trend lines, like it's probably not going to somehow calm down anytime soon.
Yeah, that's a great segue. We have a question from Catherine Chung, and she wanted to ask about safety for photojournalists. So I'm going to unmute her now. Hopefully I can do that. All right, Catherine, you're...
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Hi.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah,
Yes.
you can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Sorry, yeah, I just came home, so kind of settled down. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering. So we've like increasingly seen kind of erosion of like press freedom, or even like targeted attacks on journalists from like Hong Kong, U.S. And this past Monday, like Maria Ressa was like charged for cyber libel. So I'm wondering, are there any, I guess, of these safety concerns that you personally are most worried about? And kind of, do you have any advice for like more like early career journalists of how to, I guess, address these?
Thank you.
I mean, I don't really know. I think, physical safety is something I feel pretty confident about, but that kind of legal safety is something that for, Hong Kong and the US even, and the Philippines, it's really scary because it's this creeping authoritarianism, right? We don't know where the line is. We don't know how far they'll go, what the consequences might be. So it is scary. And for me, I'm thinking like maybe I'll have to leave Hong Kong. And that's never really occurred to me before with, now with the national security law in Hong Kong. I think digital security is something that's really important. Making sure that your information is secure, your email is secure, your messaging channels are secure. That's one way you can be protective and make sure not, the wrong people aren't listening, and to protect your sources. In terms of how do you protect yourself against a government that wants to put you in jail or shut you up, that is hard. And I think that's a line you kind of have to draw for yourself, and after informing yourself the best you can. But I mean, that's part of the struggle, right? Like, what can you really do? And that's, and then maybe you seek asylum, but like things aren't looking so great in the US. So yeah, it's a tough question, and you just sort of have to keep track of these things. And also, as journalists, make sure that we're doing our part to put pressure on governments to not put journalists in jail, and not suppress free speech and journalists.
Can you also make sure that you have a relationship with, if you're solo, with like a organization that helps journalists legally ahead of time? So like you don't want to find yourself in that position after the fact, and then you don't know how to get help. Like you definitely want to have relationships. You want to have, however you're going to contact them, you want to have that available to yourself. Like even if it's even if it's like seems like it may be a long shot, a lot of publicity around people getting arrested sometimes helps. And then I'm talking about outside of the US. Obviously I'm American, so I don't have to worry about that. But like, I would think if you have a relationship, or you can have one, at least like that's the least you could do. I don't know.
No, it's definitely a good point. Just having other people have your back is very, very helpful. And important.
And that they know like when you're going out, and
yes, that
covering
too.
the story. And
like, so in Hong Kong, we had like this big WhatsApp group for a bunch of journalists, and that was really helpful for the couple times when journalists were arrested. Someone might be like, hey, I saw these guys get arrested, I'm not sure what their names are, and like, they describe them. Someone's like, oh, I know them. Or another time a friend got arrested, and I was like, and I knew she, is a single mom. So I was like, oh shoot, like I need to make sure her kids are okay. So, having that, I know she was really, thank goodness someone saw her get arrested, and they were able to get the word out to people who knew what to do and to contact her family. Cause, if it weren't for that, I think it could have been a scary situation. So, having, whether it's informal support at the least, and institutional support if you can find it.
Yeah. Great. So we've had several chats of just people saying, like incredible work, and thank you for your bravery, tenacity, and passion to witness these struggles and capture these powerful images and share them with the world. I'm just gonna, we've gone a little bit over because Laura, I know it's late for you, and I promise to try to keep it as close to an hour as possible, but we've gone a little bit over. So thanks for staying.
Of course.
You know, are there any final things that we should know or to look for in the future for your work or what you're doing?
I think, well, one, Leah and I keep talking about the parallels between the US and Hong Kong that we see. And I think, what the world really needs to start thinking about is solidarity. We're seeing solidarity across the US on a scale that, maybe hasn't been seen before, at least not recently. And I think to start thinking about what international solidarity means. So for example, I think one really interesting thing is there were a lot of pro-US rallies in Hong Kong because Hong Kong was specifically asking President Trump and Congress to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which they actually did. But those were kind of spearheaded by a lot of Republican politicians who are now, against the Black Lives Matter movement, but Hong Kong protesters are sort of grappling with that because they understand that Black Lives Matter is also against police brutality and it's also against injustice. So I think, hopefully as we all deal with our own home's struggles, we can stay informed about the whole world's struggles and start talking about solidarity and how these issues are relevant to everyone and how, as they say, injustice anywhere is relevant to, is injustice to everyone. I'm butchering that quote, but so I hope everyone can sort of start seeing the parallels across all of these stories and start thinking about how we can all solve them together.
Yeah. Leah, go ahead. I'll let you finish up.
I think I just want to amplify what you said in the beginning about Hong Kong, because if we stop paying attention to what's happening over there, it's a canary in a coal mine situation. So it's going to not just affect Hong Kong, it's going to affect the whole world. And it's a really dangerous moment for a lot of people, a lot of countries, especially during this pandemic. It's kind of a smokescreen potentially. So people just, I know that everyone's tired, but we just have to keep amplifying our colleagues' work and encouraging our communities to also pay attention to what's going on outside of our own spaces.
Yeah. And to add to that real quick is I know Leah and I have been talking about this, how seeing what's happening in the US, you kind of, it's weird because, we faced the worst of the epidemic for us was, earlier this year. And then a few months later, we saw the West deal with it. And then the same thing with the protests and the police brutality. Not that they're brand new issues, but just seeing this weird, seeing history repeat itself is really heartbreaking, because you would hope that the least that can come out of, people going through this before is that lessons can be learned, and it sometimes doesn't seem that way. So I also hope, if more people pay more attention to things elsewhere, then we can avoid some of those same mistakes and learn from each other.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I hope it's not just the police learning from each other about how to protesters.
Protesters are learning too.
Yeah, the protesters are learning too, which is great. I mean, which I think definitely Hong Kong has been a leading, the protesters there have been amazing. So All right. Thank you both so much for your time and for sharing your incredible photos with us and your experiences. And this has been amazing. I want to thank the sponsors, Fujifilm, Tamron, Multiple Exposure Gallery, Peak Design, Capital Photography Center, KEH Camera. They've helped put together this whole virtual photo festival that we've had for the last 2.5 months. This might be the last one. I'm not sure. I got to find out from Joe. But so we're going out with a bang. I appreciate you guys being part of this. And we'll look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks, everyone.